I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's program with Wendy Lower and Paul Salmons. We're here to discuss Wendy's excellent new book, The Ravine, A Family, a Photograph, a Holocaust Massacre Revealed, which was just released 2 months ago. The book explores a single and quite exceptional image and the new understandings that the image has unlocked about the Holocaust. You can order your book at the link in the Zoom chat. Wendy is the acclaimed author of Hitler's Furies and chair of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Academic Council, in addition to the author of the book we'll be exploring today. Paul, joining us from the UK, is a Holocaust education specialist, curator of the groundbreaking exhibition Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, which is on display here in New York until this Sunday. Chief curator of Seeing Auschwitz and consultant to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, among his other work. While Wendy and Paul chat today, please feel free to share questions for them in the Zoom Q&A box anytime during the discussion, and we'll leave some time to address audience questions. Without further ado, welcome Wendy and Paul. Thanks for being here and sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thank you so much, Ari. It's a delight to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Wendy. By way of introduction, I just wanted to say a couple of things about how the Holocaust has been remembered and the importance of photography in our collective imagination. By way of introduction to Wendy's book, which gives us, in many ways, a fresh look at this history and disrupts, I think, some of the common myths and misconceptions about the Holocaust. And that's one of the areas I'd really love to explore with you, Wendy, today. So I just wonder if, Wendy, if you don't mind sharing your screen, there's a photograph I wanted to begin with, which is not the photograph, of course, from your book. But by way of introduction, as I say, I'd like to just talk a bit about what how the Holocaust has been remembered and how it's framed within so much of our collective imagination, which I want to argue has been dominated by a number of iconic images. Many of them have been strongly informed by photographs of Auschwitz, such as this one. We see, again, in our mind's eye, when we think about the Holocaust, often it's steam locomotives pulling a line of freight wagons arriving on the ramp, in this case at Auschwitz-Birkenau, its gateway looming over the scene. Thousands of Jewish people have spilled out onto that ramp and are quickly divided into two large groups. We see men and older boys on one side, women and young children on the other. In the foreground, you see prisoners in striped uniforms directing them, and they walk in lines towards a uniformed SS doctor who directs each person in turn to the left or the right. Few of them for work inside the concentration camp complex, the vast majority to the gas chambers and crematoria, where they will be murdered within hours of their arrival, their bodies turned to ash. Some 1.3 million people were deported to Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. 1 million of those Jewish people were murdered there. They came from all over Europe on railway lines that crisscrossed the continent. The key point being that victims were made mobile, carried hundreds of miles to stationary death camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau or to Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, where their killers awaited them. But while these images are ingrained on our collective memories, they show the period towards the end of the Holocaust. This photograph was taken in the spring or summer of 1944. When systematic mass murder of Jews began, from the murder actually looked very different. From the summer of 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, it was, that's fine, you can, thank you, yes, we can move on to the next photo if you like. It was the murder squads that became mobile. Their victims were scattered in towns and villages over vast distances where they were murdered close to their homes. We have very few images of this other aspect of the Holocaust, this Holocaust by bullets, but it's One such photograph, this one, of course, which is the focus of Professor Lower's new book, The Ravine. And I think part of the significance of this book is that it helps to recenter a systematic mass murder process that was to claim the lives of up to 2 million men, women, and children, much further east than Auschwitz and the other death camps. So it's to this image that we now turn, and I wanted to give you just a few moments to take in this scene. It's a very difficult image, of course, to look upon. And rather than just launching straight in, Wendy and I were wondering if you just wanted to take a moment to look at the photograph yourself, understand what's happening here, and perhaps in the chat, you might want to, I don't think you need to describe what's actually taking place. We can see that on one level, it's self-evident, but what are the kinds of questions that would arise for you now looking at this image? What kinds of questions do you have about this scene? Then I'm going to ask Wendy to help us read this image more closely and also speak to the questions that she had when she first encountered it. But if you want to just in the chat put some of your thoughts and questions, so I can see who's doing the shooting. So who are the perpetrators? Who are the killers? Thank you, Deborah. Are there other questions people have? What do the perpetrators feel about this? Who's taking the photo? He's asking. Whose shoes are those? Where was the photograph taken? Who's the fifth male? Is he a civilian? One soldier looks like he's smiling. Okay, great. So these are it's a boy holding, his mother holding the boy's hand. The comments are coming in, the questions are coming in so quickly, it's hard to keep up with them all. So I apologize if I'm not reading them all out. I hope you're following along, looking at them yourselves. What time of day is it? Where did it happen? Great questions, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm so delighted that we have Professor Lower with us today to help us read this image and to tell us about the immense research that went into her new book. So I'm going to ask now, Wendy, when did you first encounter this photograph? What were your first thoughts on seeing it? What did you understand from this?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm so glad these questions are coming and they continue to come in. And that's really what this is all about, is posing those questions. This is what I did when I first saw it in 2009. And probably the biggest question that comes to mind when one looks at this is, what does one do upon the discovery of such an image of murder? And that's what's happening in this photo, the act of murder. And it's a rare document, a rare piece of evidence of the Holocaust by bullets, as Paul described it, outside the killing centers. And there's so much to really discover. And they're in this image. And as all of you have already noted in your questions, there are so many clues here that need to be looked at more closely. And that was the purpose of the book, was to pose that challenge of how much can be found out from one singular image, knowing that it's so rare, knowing that it can represent potentially millions of people who experience this, and certainly thousands who experience this who remain missing, whose names have not been identified, or the thousands of perpetrators at these lower level kinds of operations in a small town who escaped justice, who were not prosecuted. So this image does represent an entire aspect, an entire dimension of the Holocaust. So it's an opportunity to learn. When I first came upon this in 2009, it was brought to me, and I was at the museum in Washington, D.C. in the archives. I was actually working on another project, and I was at the microfilm reader, and two journalists came from Prague, and they had found this image in the archives, in the state security archives, and were as compelled to want to do something about it. And they went so far as to travel from Prague to Washington, D.C. And on that day in August, actually I think it was August 9th to be exact, when I was there. And I wasn't living in Washington, D.C. or in the United States. I was living in Germany at the time. So it really was a coincidence. And my colleague there, who also works on Ukraine, knew I was there and said, Wendy, you've got to see this. He took me by the hand and brought me over to the table, and it was on the table. And we all stood around like this and looked at it and just started to ask questions of this image. And as we studied it, we started to kind of pick apart the elements in the way that I think the audience has started to do. Like someone raised the issue of the shoes, and these shoes in the foreground that are empty, that one wonders, who wore those shoes and what are they doing there? What is surrounding those shoes? We can see some papers or some sort of cloth. We have the advantage of digital technology. So over time, as we analyzed the image, we scanned it, we zoomed in and out, we could identify, in fact, that there are bullet casings down here. So this is the evidence of mass murder. It also indicates that these are not the only victims that we see in the picture. Broad daylight. Someone asked about the time that the picture was taken. We can see that this is an open air mass shooting taken mid-morning-ish. I would later recount in my book almost hour by hour what happened on that day. The journalists did have a little bit of very, very essential information, and that was what made it possible for us to really research this in depth. They knew the location of the photograph, Mariupol, Ukraine. They knew the date the image was that was captured, and that was October 13th, 1941. And they knew the name of the photographer. So these were three very essential pieces of information that were really enough for us to get started, for me to get started on more deep research. But when we see this and we kind of deconstruct in this way or parse it out in this way, and my book is structured along these lines of the elements of the photograph and what can be gleaned from them. Here's an important aspect of the Holocaust. If it's done outside the killing centers, outside those gas chambers, in these small communities, it is impacting that local terrain. It is part of the environmental history of these settings. I mean, down to a very more forensic level and geological level of victims who are killed en masse and buried, what it does to that landscape, what it does to the actual, composition of the soil and the terrain, the shape of the terrain, forensic kind of archaeology, environmental history. The Germans used nature. They put nature to work as part of the killing. They used ravines, they used swamps, they used rivers. And many of the victims, including the children, died in those pits. They were buried alive, and so they died under the weight of the soil, of their kin, of the blood, and that is part of the story as well, the history. And the killers, who are these killers? I was first drawn actually immediately to the killers because I thought that it was possible in 2009 that one of these individuals might still be alive, and that became my priority in the first couple of years, is to try to track down the killers and pursue the justice on behalf of the victims who did not survive this massacre. It's striking that we have German men in uniform, and I dissected their insignia, the epaulets, the collars, their sleeves, the markings on their sleeves and cuffs, to try to figure out what the unit was, the German killing unit there. And that brought me back into the kind of Nazi documentation. But look how close they are next to these Ukrainians, like shoulder to shoulder, shooting simultaneously. They don't speak the same language. These Germans have just arrived from the West, as part of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. They're part of the military operations. They don't know these Ukrainians. These are all volunteer killers right here. They share the anti-Semitic hate. They share in this act of killing. And here we also have the smoke as another clue, and the ballistics are an important part of the history because it is a crime scene photograph that we're looking at. And the smoke here indicates that shooting had occurred before these victims were brought to the edge of this pit because of the kind of haloing here, the muzzle blast that pierces the smoke that had been hovering. So there were victims that were killed before them as they came up to the pit. Was that victim who was murdered right before them could have been this man, could have been a relative. The family at the center of the photograph was really striking, that the photographer chose to take a photo and crop it and develop it in a way in following this kind of rule of thirds here, showing the landscape to the left where the victims are going to fall into the pit, having the family kind of at the center, and then the killers over here to the right. And there's the onlooker. There are witnesses in the local community. Could I go back to Mariupol, Ukraine, and find individuals who actually were at this mass murder scene and actually participated in it? These were some of the first questions, and also some of the paths of research that I started to explore, the aspects of this photo.
Thank you, Wendy. It's an extraordinary photo, and extraordinarily difficult to look at. Of course, this sort of frozen moment, as all images are, they have this kind of compelling evidential quality, because, of course, as opposed to an artistic representation, which can come from the imagination, for a photograph to exist, it's been said there are kind of barter things, so it's a kind of certificate of presence, right? That it has to, the actual scene has to have existed as well, because of the mechanism of light passing through the camera lens and the quality of the photographic paper that renders this image to us so many decades later, this one moment. Thank you for taking us through that, and those in that kind of detail. You mentioned the perpetrators there, and your first interest was in trying to track them down to try and identify them. One of the myths of the Holocaust, one of the common misconceptions, is that the killers had no choice, that if they refused an order to murder, they would be killed themselves. So I'd like to ask you, first of all, how did you uncover the identities of these killers? What was your process of the research? And what does the story that you uncovered reveal about the agency of the perpetrators themselves?
Well, as it turns out, these Germans here were not part of what we think of as a regular perpetrator unit that fell under the command of Heinrich Himmler, who was Hitler's right-hand man in commanding all of the SS and police security operations. And that was what the Einsatzgruppen, and these mobile killing units are probably the most well-known of those perpetrators. And that initially I thought, oh, or the order police. We have a historian, Christopher Browning, who wrote a book called Ordinary Men that brought out the fact that the foot soldiers of the Holocaust, the legions of kind of shooters in these operations, were mostly these order policemen, these regular cops who had been, patrolling the streets of Bremen, what have you. And there was an order police unit that went through Mariupol in September 41. And it was the same unit that went on to Babi Yar. So this is all, seeing this landscape here, for instance, the fact the book is called The Ravine, is really trying to touch on this reality in Ukraine of the use of the ravine and these mobile killers and these order police killers, and the kind of what we know about Babi Yar. And then in fact, Babi Yar, September 41, over 33,000 Jews killed in 2.5 days, 2 days, that there were many like mini versions of Babi Yar kind of across Ukraine. But it turns out that those smaller communities like this one, Mariupol, this historic shtetl, that the order police that were at Babi Yar and went through this little town, they actually they kind of developed their techniques of mass shooting, because they're highly organized. It's its own kind of system that they developed in these smaller towns, kind of leading up to these bigger massacres. About maybe 300 people were killed, 300 people. The estimates of this massacre are not really clear. So that kind of history was known. but it didn't square with these uniforms. The more I studied them and the more I looked at the chronology of October 41, when I could not place any of the real SS units or Einsatzgruppen units or this police unit, they weren't there on October 13th, 1941. And I had that date and I had to stick with that date because the photographer, knew best and took the picture on that day and testified to that day. And so what happened was I realized in the photographer's description, because he did, along with providing the date and the location of the photograph, he mentioned one detail, which was really critical. He said that the Germans who were there, and he was close, you could see he's standing close to the scene of the crime, he called them finance guards. He didn't say Gestapo or SS or German soldiers. He was very specific, finance guards. So then I went back to the finance ministry, a completely different German agency that had trained for the campaign, this military campaign, these customs guards who were supposed to be checking packages at the local train station or working at the post office. And they were recruited on the spot. An SS officer came in the night before this happened. They were playing cards, Scott, in the local canteen on a Sunday night. And the SS officer said, "We hear there are still Jews in this town. What's going on here? You need to clean up your, this can't be, there should be no more Jews in this town. And who's going to carry this out? It has to happen immediately." And these German killers here stood up and said, "Jawohl, I volunteer. I will do this tomorrow." They saw it as an opportunity. They were, and within that unit, it was a company actually, almost 100 men in that unit that was stationed in Mariupol. These were kind of the worst of the notorious anti-Semites and in that unit. And so it wasn't surprising when these individuals stood up and said, yes, and the reason why I know this is because in 1969, this photograph is sitting in a archive in Prague, behind the Iron Curtain. Slovakian had taken it. And meanwhile, in Germany in 1969, one of the members of this German Customs Guard unit, who's not in the photo, who was not one of the killers, decides as a retired, retired from, he stayed in the customs working as a customs guard after the war, and he retired, and maybe he had a conscience. Well, he decided he was going to go into his local police station near Hanover and report a crime that had happened in 1941 in a small town called Mariupol, and identified these killers. And so the West Germans pursued this case rather perfunctorily, but at least there was something there to determine, to establish that in fact these were these people, they were there. Now they tracked down one of these killers, the other one could not be found. And I had the benefit of the photograph that I could compare while I was reading his testimony. And of course, he was just obfuscating, denying, lying. I wasn't there. The Ukrainians did all the killing, not the Germans. I'm not in the SS and police, so I'm not, this was not my job. These kinds of explanations and excuses.
Right, and that idea, that notion that we have that the people who did take part had no choice also, of course, comes partly from the testimonies of people facing trial after the war, right? That this would have been a good defense to stand on if it could have been shown that people ordered to murder Jews who had refused were either shot themselves or sent to concentration camps, that this would be a good defense in the trials after the war.
No, there's no evidence in this case of peer pressure, following orders. This is not what they're trained to do.
Right.
And they had kind of escaped our attention because they weren't declared a kind of Nazi criminal organization after the war. They were just part of the finance ministry. So, they went undetected, and they didn't know this photo existed either.
And to my understanding as well, when investigators did try to find such cases, they haven't actually been able to uncover a single case of someone being shot for refusing, a German officer or a German policeman, German soldier being shot for refusing to kill Jews. Right? This is a myth which has grown up, which I wonder if one of the reasons why we seize upon it, again in our collective imaginations, is that somehow that would make the atrocities themselves easier for us to understand and to explain. We often tend to rely on either this notion that people had no choice or that they were mad, evil psychopaths. And yet the reality, as you show in your book and through this study of these perpetrators, somehow is a lot more horrifying, right? That there's a lot of volunteerism, that people chose to participate and that people on the whole were not forced to, because the authorities didn't need to force people to take part. There were enough willing killers, right, amongst these ordinary men.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So every time we look at a photograph, however many people we see in that image, I want to suggest that there are always two more people that are present, the photographer and ourselves. And Wendy, you've shown us how we can be more than just a passive spectator to this scene, how we can critically deconstruct it. And you've guided us through how we can kind of read each element and take it apart for meaning. But I'd like you also to tell us something then about the photographer and the photographer's gaze. How were you able to identify him? Who was he? Why did he take the photograph? And did this, as you uncovered that story, did that change at all how you were reading this image?
This was really the biggest surprise of all. And I was really pleased to be able to write kind of his biography and figure out his story. That's one of the reasons why I got into this project, was an overall concern about the use of such imagery in museums and in textbooks and in teaching, and how do we handle them. And the fact that so many of these images were in circulation without captions and without a deep knowledge of the people who took them, of the photographers. We have some information about Jewish photographers, definitely from the ghettos, some wonderful work done by some of my colleagues. But a lot of these images, knowing the photographer's story, as I'm going to share it with you in a moment, is yet another dimension of this, and also tests our assumptions of the history. So this is taken at close range, this picture. It's a stable image. It's not taken clandestinely. So someone who's there, presumably with permission. He's a Slovakian guard, as I told you, in uniform. I mean, for the victims, he's just another one of the killers, another one of the gang, if he's there with his uniform, and even worse, if they even noticed, humiliating them further by pulling out his camera and taking them at their last moment of death. And this is not how anyone wants to die, and certainly not how anyone wants to be portrayed at the end of one's life for kind of posterity. And it turns out that the photographer was really, here's the testimony that he gave in 1958, and he gave the three testimonies in 43, 58, and 59. This was the testimony that the two journalists from Prague also brought with them, that provided more information, and an incredibly intelligent, responsible man who here is telling us exactly, and very clever, the camera that he was using, the model camera, which was important as well. Here is the actual camera that he used. We were able to track that down, and here's our photographer. Lubomir Skrovina, as it turns out, was anti-war, anti-political, hated the fascists, did not want to sign, was forced into military service. It was he was a young man, able-bodied man. He was recruited for Operation Barbarossa. He was born in 1916. He died in 2005. And he was the company scribe of this kind of reinforcement guard unit that came in the wake of the German advance. And they settled in these small towns. He was the company scribe, and he was an avid photographer. So he brought his handheld camera. And when he was in the barracks that morning, when it started, the massacre started in the morning on that day, and heard the shooting and the screams. And his commander said, go check it out. And so he went with another, one of the Slovakian guards, his friend. And that's when he started to take these pictures. But he took them as his turning point. It was the moment in which he started to write letters back to his wife and explain to her, I've had enough. This is not the war. You can't believe what's happening here. My hair is turning gray. My mind is black. He's talking about drinking and, you know, just unable to continue on, but also determined with his camera to document what was happening, and secretly getting extra rolls of film his wife was sending to him through the mail. And he went back to Bratislava. He went back to his hometown of Banska Bystrica, which was a center of Slovakian resistance, and showed these photos to Jews who hadn't been deported yet, and warned them, this is what's going to happen to you when you show up to the railway station. So he ended up actually hiding a Jewish family in his attic, and the Jewish man was an OBGYN, and he actually delivered his son Lubomir Jr. in 1943. He had a car, he was a technician, he had a radio shop, and he was a courier for the resistance movement, also bringing Jews to the forest, to hideouts in the forest. And sadly, not all of those Jews survived in 44 when the Germans occupied and brought in yet another Einsatzgruppe to Slovakia, in this case, in August 1944. Here's Lubomir. I got this from his family. They shared this with me. And on the back side, he had written September 17th, 1941. So here he is, and Mirapol, and noting the location. So that was another good source. So here he is in the town of Mirapol about a month before that mass shooting, and he's here in the center. And this is in the photo studio in Mirapol. It's interesting. The Jewish community, a Jewish man ran that photo studio in Mirapol, and I wondered if he was actually in that location. I don't know for sure, but it's just another interesting aspect of this wartime photograph.
Thank you. These photographs then, in terms of who actually took the photograph and for what purpose, for what reason, I think it disrupts that idea that we sometimes have when we look at an archival photo, as if we're kind of looking through a window in time. We're looking directly back on the past as it was. And I think what you're doing there is to help remind us that actually we don't see the past through a kind of window. We see it through the eyes of the person who took that photo, through their camera lens. They've framed that moment, they've chosen that particular second, they've composed it in that way. It means something to them. And so the meaning shifts, doesn't it, very much, that when we think that this might be a collaborator, if we think this is a perpetrator, if this is a kind of memento of actions that are kind of being willingly done, it's very different for us than seeing an image through the eyes of someone who was shaken by those events and then later on risked his own life to resist against them. It's an extraordinary story that you uncovered there.
Yeah, the power of the photograph, as we analyze it and understand that it's capturing that moment historically, and our return to that moment and our investigation of the moment, but the power of the photograph as it kind of moves, it's got its own agency as far as what it does in the hands of the photographer, as he shows it to the Jewish community, as he's questioned about it after the war, as these journalists come to Washington with this photograph, and then I pick up on it. Now we're all looking at it and studying it, and people have written to me with more discoveries, you know, as they've analyzed it more closely in the book. But he took the photos, he took more than one. The camera model, that Zeiss Icon, could handle the film that he was using, like maybe 9, I don't know, about at most 10 exposures. And Paul, I shared some with you as well. There are at least 5 in the archives. I went back to Prague, obviously, to go to these original files. And it's clear that he took them in a way to show us as a visual testimony, as a visual narration, the process. And we have this in other photographs as well, and in Nazi photo albums too, to show step by step the Jews who resisted on the path, and then finally the image from above of the victims, in the pit. So there's a lot of analysis these days on testimony, audiovisual testimony, written testimony, diaries. And in the book, I try to bring out the value of these kinds of visual testimonies that these photographers who we would call them today kind of human rights photographers, that they're trying to document the violation so that it can be used to overcome it and prevent.
So given that, Wendy, the question asked by Max kind of takes on an even heightened importance then, given that some photographers at least could be doing this for a kind of resistance purpose. Max asked, why would the killers have been okay with a photographer capturing acts like that? I mean, you can only speculate, of course, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, another element of this historically is that it's the era of the kind of explosion of the consumption, the manufacturing and consumption of the handheld camera in the 20s and 30s. In the First World War, we have obviously the very famous Battle of the Somme moving footage from the First World War, and also a lot of stills, a lot of photography of the troops and turned into postcards and all that. So there is a whole visual archive from the First World War, but it's mostly official photography. It's not, ordinary soldiers with handheld cameras. But with the Leica and the Zeiss Icon being patented in the 20s and 30s, the ordinary soldiers, ordinary folks were hobby photographers, and Lubomir's part of that whole trend. I looked at his personal papers, and he was reading these hobby photography magazines and learning about how to develop your own pictures and all of that. And the Nazis themselves were promoting the use of the camera for ordinary soldiers. This is an advertisement from a military magazine. It says the optical Panzer, this promoting the fact that this camera is going to withstand shrapnel and warfare, and it's around the neck of the German there, and it's part of how the German interacts with the home front. There's the postcard and the care package, and here's another one of the Agfa photo company saying the photos are a bridge between you and the kind of the home front. So while the Germans and Goebbels and the propaganda ministry were embedding photojournalists and producing these visual record of the war for propaganda purposes, and it was supposed to be this triumphant moment that everyone could celebrate and remember through these images. They were at the same time frantically issuing orders as soon as the mass murder started, as soon as the atrocities were so widespread as of the summer of 41. Do not take photos of the atrocities and they will be confiscated. And these orders were issued and reissued till the end of the war. So they could not control that. They knew it was going to fall into the hands of, say, the Polish underground. They knew that these atrocity images were going to be circulating back in the Reich, be developed back in the Reich. So there was this, contradictory kind of countervailing type of reality of let's document our triumph, but not everything, not the actual mass murder that is part of the policy of the conquest of the war, the official policy.
Right, and there was a question from Freddie about how many ravines like this were there, and I think in a sense you're speaking to that also, because there were just so many, hundreds, thousands of examples like this, right? Over thousands of square miles. Every town and village where Jewish people might reside were combed because of this, the totality of this genocide, this intent on killing every last Jewish man, woman, and child everywhere. Because of the number, a very small number of photographs like this obviously were taken. We won't have them all, of course. There were more than we actually have come to our knowledge, but it's a tiny number of these images that we have, right, out of the huge number of killings that were taking place. Exactly,
that huge disproportion. The image that we've been studying, there is a ravine in Mirapol, and the first time I visited there, a local person took me to that ravine. That was the first place she took me to. And in fact, it was by the river. And part of it's because of the environmental history. You have this landscape of rivers, you know, and valleys and, you know, natural kind of elevation for carrying out this event, you know, to have someone standing at the precipice, and then they would often use like a pole or a stick or just kick them into the pit. But not every town had a ravine. They were digging a lot of, the picture that we're looking at was actually, that was a dug out mass grave, but they also used the anti-tank ditches. You know, it was part of the process was the surveying of the local terrain or talking to people locally and trying to find that location at the edge of town. Yeah, there are hundreds of these mass murder sites that Father Desbois and others have identified, and interviewed thousands of witnesses who have stood at those sites and given testimony as to what occurred at those sites across Ukraine. 1 out of every 4th victim of the Holocaust, as in those who died in the Holocaust, because the survival rate in Ukraine was very low, resided in what are the borders of Ukraine today. So that's the kind of, you know, topography of the kind of Holocaust by bullets, as Paul was describing at the beginning.
Thank you. And Wendy, we've considered that image from our own perspective, and you've given us that guided reading through what we can detect and when we look so closely. We've identified the killers. We now know who the photographer was, his motivation and his story, but still the victims at the moment remain anonymous to us. They're almost, not quite, but almost without any agency at all in this moment of death. Not quite without agency, because even in the moment of death, the woman shields a child on her lap. She holds the hand of the young boy. And I think you told me that in another photograph, you identify in the pit, actually the hands of the woman and the child are still clasped together, even in death. So there is some agency, a tiny amount there, yet still they remain anonymous. And what I want to ask you is, why was it important for you to really know who these people were? What did it mean to you to uncover the lives of the murdered people, and how did you go about this?
Well, as I mentioned before, looking at an image like this of murder, wanting to pursue the perpetrators first and foremost, but restore the lives of the murdered, of these victims, because it's to look at an image like this is so outrageous, and it offends us, it shames us, it breaks our heart. And what can you do as far as redress? You know, there's historical justice, but there's a more symbolic, in my mind, and real, not just symbolic, but real need to name those victims and try to understand their lives, not understand their deaths, but understand their lives and what was lost. Also, maybe by identifying their names, find their relatives or any survivors, and put a human being's life, face, story to what is otherwise a massive event of, you know, where we talk about millions at Babi Yar, or millions who died in Warsaw, or 6 million. And so for me to bring it down, especially to the family unit, because as I looked into this more and thought about the experience of genocide or the history of genocide, that aspect of the family, whether the genocidaires, as Hitler said in the summer of 41, when this was exploding across Ukraine, every Jewish family has to be removed from the continent of Europe. And he used the word family when he was talking to his Croatian ally, because they had it's a racist program that seeks root and branch genealogically to eradicate an entire people. It's that biological thinking, that racial thinking. And the family unit was seen as the procreative unit, like if that would be wiped out, then there'd be no future generations. And Hitler and Himmler said, and if children survive or any relatives survive, they are going to avenge the deaths of their their brothers and their mothers and fathers. And so for their notion of a final solution, as they called it, that was an important element. And for those who experienced the Holocaust, just the absolute, if it's the crime of all crimes, then the horror of all horrors is to be killed with your family members and to witness that and their torture or to die with them. It's just everyone's biggest nightmare. And so that to me was in trying to understand kind of the ultimate of what genocide is, the family part of the story, I thought was important to stress. And so, but how does one research that? First of all, there are great websites like Jewish Gen that were really important. So there's wonderful community of descendants and second generation, even third generation now, who are trying to keep their family histories alive or reconstruct them, and they were really helpful. But we have documentation from the archives itself. This was the Soviet attempt immediately when the Mariupol was reoccupied in 44, liberated. They put these lists together and working off these lists, trying to see these family units. These are the surnames. You can see the birth dates here. You can see children. You can see really elderly. You can see single names. You can see widows. And so the photo, couldn't see the age of the woman, but the boy, right? So that was easier to determine. So I started to look at some of these lists to try to see if I could find a family unit, find a child, someone born between 35 and 38 or 30, he's walking as a toddler, and work that way down these lists, which are incomplete. There, we don't have a full list of the victims, so we're working from incomplete sources, but that's all we have. So that's what I just pursued that and went to the Yad Vashem. And these are the pages of testimony to see if maybe someone had reported them missing, and started to think about, well, what if there's nobody left to report someone missing? And the notion of genocide, and that you have the missing that we're trying to identify, and especially the children. And this was a photograph that popped up on the screen that was attached to a page of testimony. And this is a testimony about Jews in Mariupol who've been murdered in the park in 1941. So it was very close to our photo as far as what that is, that history there. And remarkably, this family photograph attached to it, which is super rare. The archivist told me less than 1% of the pages of testimonies have wartime photos, and certainly not family portraits like this. And this was incredibly beautiful, if I could call it that, beautiful, because it is not like the one we've been studying. It's a photo of a Jewish, what's left of a Jewish family, women and children, in 1941, taken at that studio, I believe, in Mariupol, where a few months later, Lubomir had his picture taken that I just showed you. And there, that is that little boy's face there in that sailor suit. And it just so reminded me of the boy in the picture. And here's this other child. And if you look at the picture closely, and this woman, maybe she's bending over in a perpendicular way. And we'll go back to that. It looks like there's another child on her lap about this size and build. But this is how these, the Vassiliuk family wanted to be remembered at the very end. Actually, they had already lost their husbands, and this was during the occupation.
Thank you. It's an extraordinarily important and powerful image, isn't it? That we are often left with the image, again, in our collective imagination of the Holocaust as just the heaps of corpses that we know from the liberation of Bergen-Belsen and other sites, or the anonymous victims, and the fact that you've been able to recover who perhaps these people were, and to show us their faces as they saw themselves.
Yeah, and here I'm showing the image to the Ukrainians who were alive during the war and had Jewish classmates, or who worked in the paper factory and remembered, their Jewish colleagues, and just bringing this photograph around to that community to stir up their imagination and their memories of their Jewish neighbors. Then that triggered more recollections of names of Jews in that community to add to the list. So again, the photograph as a kind of force for memory, for collecting more information.
And as you're taking us back there to the present day, the same community today, Stephanie's asked, is there a marker of any kind in Mariupol?
Yes, there are actually now, there is not a marker at the site of the mass murder. This is a typical Soviet monument to the Second World War, not referring specifically to the Jews, but to kind of all peaceful Soviet citizens, universalizing the victims. But this was the heart of Mariupol historically, where the Jewish community resided. It used to be a very vibrant marketplace. You can see buildings are missing here now. It's pretty desolate, and this is what it looks like now after a century of Stalinization, genocide, Sovietization, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now war in Ukraine, Russian occupation, and so forth. So this is a contemporary image. When the Soviets pursued their justice in this case, which came late in 85, 86, during kind of Glasnost, Perestroika era, they tracked down, there was kind of success in that story as far as tracking down those Ukrainians in the photograph who were arrested and tried in 85. And 2 of the 3 Ukrainian killers were actually executed in 1986. One of them was given a 15-year jail sentence. He was a youth during the time of when he committed the murder. And at that, in conjunction with that Soviet trial, which was a very extensive investigation, thousands and thousands of pages, impressively, they put together these sketches and maps of what happened that day. And these arrows show the path the Jews took. And down here is the actual crime scene. And here are the records of this is one of the defendants. So this is one of the men of the Ukrainians who's pictured in the image. There he is. There's his arrest photo, his fingerprints. And in conjunction with that investigation, the Soviets carried out an exhumation because they needed to find the bones of the victims as part of the trial. And they went into the forest here. The defendants now showed them where this occurred. And we follow that path. I'm here with the team, with Yahad and Unam, to go back and to see what we're going to discover. And in fact, the landscape, as I mentioned earlier on, was very visibly disrupted. We have odd mounds, vegetation is scarred. It was just strange place to stand in the forest. And in fact, we even just went down into the muck of the leaves and started to remove the under the surface, and immediately found bones, and we found vertebrae, and we found skull fragments, because during the exhumation in 85 for the trial, they brought in some pretty heavy machinery to conduct that, and completely overturned the mass grave. They're using the tractors and whatnot. And so that's why those bones came to the surface. But it remains unprotected, this site. I reported it to my German colleagues who work at the Denkmal in Berlin. And unfortunately, they are unable to kind of cordon it off and erect a monument there. And the fact is, it's not that they don't want to, it's just that they have hundreds of sites now that they're trying to preserve. And I know it's not like an excuse, but the reality is that there are many of these sites. And this particular site is part of a military base. It would involve negotiations with the Ukrainian government. It's also already extremely disrupted. And they were having problems with the ground penetrating radar. And so they were hesitant, reluctant to even start that. But during that exhumation, some of the bones of the victims were brought to another location, and a memorial was erected in town near the river. You can see it today. And Jews came back from family members who had emigrated before the war from Canada and Israel, and they participated in that service. And so there was a reburial of some of the Jewish bones in a memorial location.
Thank you. So I know we're very short of time now, and there's so many questions that have come flooding in. So I apologize to those whose questions we haven't been able to get to. I urge you to read the book. The answers to your questions almost certainly will be in that remarkable work. There is a question from Deborah, though, about were there any survivors? And I know you looked at that in your book. Perhaps that's something to speak to. And then you close your book with this image of the shoes. So perhaps we should, after you've answered that, also end this talk with those images also.
Okay. I know of one survivor who gave testimony, Ludmila Blechman, and I draw heavily from her account. She crawled out of the pit and then miraculously survived 3 years of the odyssey of being in hiding and being arrested, interrogated, and living in the forest. And the survivor, the rate in Ukraine is incredibly low, below 1%, in places 3%. The assault was so rapid and so thorough that, as the genocidaires wished, they just wanted there to be no traces. And a commando unit came back in and sometimes disinterred some of these graves and ground the bones and burned the victims' remains and cremated them. And it just was really so difficult for an ordinary person to survive this, so dependent on the local population to shelter and clothe and feed them. To have to sustain that over years is really nearly impossible. Most of the survivors who came from Ukraine were able to kind of evacuate early on in the war, get out of that terrain to go south into Romania. There were Transnistria, there were ghettos there where one could hide, go to the forest, maybe join a partisan unit. Some survived who were deported to camps, but if one were had to remain on that terrain, as I described it, of the borders of Ukraine today, it was very, very difficult to survive.
And the image of the shoes that you're leaving us with here?
Well, it was interesting. Somebody brought this up because it was the haunting kind of image, although it's not the central, the center of the photograph. I was pleased that somebody else all kind of picked up on that. And I think it's because it's part of both our memorial culture, and I just showed a slide before of the shoes on the Danube, or the shoes on display at Birkenau. But the power of these empty shoes, actually, as a metaphor of loss and silence, is not purely a post-war kind of phenomenon. Actually, Abraham, a Yiddish poet, Abraham Sutzkever, had written a poem in 1943, in January 43, called "A Load of Shoes," and he wrote it upon the discovery of his deported mother's shoes in the Vilna ghetto. And it's beautiful. If I just read a few stanzas, as this is the poem, Sutzkever. The feet from these boots with buttons outside, or these with no body, or these with no bride. Where is the child who fit in these? Is the maiden barefoot who bought these? Slippers and pumps. Look, there are my mother's, her Sabbath pair, in with the others. In Sutzkever's poem, empty boots, slippers, and pumps exist somewhere between the living and the dead, among the children, maidens, and brides at a wedding or observing Sabbath. His shoes dance and patter. They stimulate our ability to imagine the past and provide poetic testimony to the lives of the wearers, unlike those haunting but inert objects we see today enshrined behind glass in Birkenau or bronzed on it as a memorial alongside the Danube River in Budapest. Like flawed testimonies and memories, photographs can mislead because they can never completely capture the reality of the event pictured or those involved. The Jewish man who was murdered, perhaps with his family, is not there, although his empty shoes and crumpled coat remain. We cannot see beyond the frame of the image. We can't turn 360 degrees to take in the entire setting of victims waiting to be killed, other possible onlookers, including our Slovakian photographer and his comrades, and more German officials. The papers strewn amid the bullet casings at the edge of the mass grave could be German lists or Jewish identity documents. Atrocity images, especially the rare ones that attest to the acts of genocide, the crime of all crimes, offend and shame us. When we turn away from them, we promote ignorance. When we display them in museums without captions and download them from the internet with no historical context, we denigrate the victims. And when we stop researching them, we cease to care about historical justice, the threat of genocide, and the murdered missing. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Just to say, although, as you remarked there, we're not able to look beyond the frame of the photo, just in that one photograph and that one perhaps 1/100th of a second that is captured there, today you have obviously given us a vast landscape of the Holocaust. So thank you so much for such a powerful and moving and thought-provoking talk. I'm sure others will go to your book and seek more. Ari, I know I'd just like to pass back to you. And again, thank you for inviting me. It's been a privilege to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Amazing to learn from you both, Wendy and Paul. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And I do want to reinforce what Paul said, which is that we didn't get a chance to get to a lot of questions, but that's really what Wendy gets into in detail in the book. So we hope you guys will order it of the link in the Zoom chat. And we have really paid attention to trying to program more around the Holocaust by bullets and some of the untold stories of the Holocaust here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. So stay with us and on our mailing list and at future events, and we hope to continue the discussion. I also want to mention that we have a program this Thursday about a different moment of sort of public racial violence. We're exploring the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. It's one of the largest incidents of racial violence in American history. That's this Thursday evening, and we're looking at the similarities and differences between that and anti-Semitic violence against Jews in Europe. So we hope that you guys will join us for that discussion, also about a somewhat unknown or not widely enough known moment of our own history here. So, and the link to that and to all of our work at the museum, which we hope you will support, is in the Zoom chat. Wendy and Paul, thank you so much again, and stay well.